Hello again, 102. In this video, we will conclude Chapter 29, the Conservative Revival, and we will go over George Herbert Walker Bush, his attempts to create the post-Cold War policy, and some of the events also in foreign policy. In Panama, and the end of the Cold War. It didn't spell the end of international tensions and conflict. Indeed, by the end of 1989, U.S. troops were engaged in battle in Panama, where a petty tyrant provoked the first of America's military engagements under George Herbert Walker Bush. In 1983, General Manuel Noriega had become the leader of the Panamanian Defense Forces, which made him head of government, in fact, if not in title. And in 1988, federal grand juries in Miami and Tampa had indicted Noriega and 15 others on charges of drug trafficking. The next year, the Panamanian president tried to fire Noriega, but the National Assembly ousted the president instead and named Noriega maximum leader. The legislatures then declared Panama in a state of war with the United States. And on December 16, 1989, a U.S. Marine in Panama was killed, whereupon President Bush ordered an invasion of Panama to capture Noriega and install a government to be headed by Guillermo Endara, who had won the presidency in a recent election nullified by Noriega. And this was a slaughter. In the early morning of December 20, U.S. troops struck at strategic targets in the country, and within hours, Noriega had surrendered, and 23 U.S. servicemen were killed in the action, and estimates of Panamanian casualties, including many civilians, were as high as 4,000. And in April of 1992, Noriega was convicted in the United States on 8 counts of racketeering and drug distribution. This is the high point of George Herbert Walker Bush's presidency, the first Gulf War. And months later, Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, focused the United States' attention back upon the Middle East when his army suddenly invaded its tiny neighbor, Kuwait, on August 2, 1990. Kuwait had recently increased production of oil, contrary to agreements with the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, and the resulting drop in global oil prices offended the Iraqi regime, which was deeply in debt and heavily dependent upon oil revenues. President Bush condemned Iraq's naked aggression, and he dispatched planes and troops to Saudi Arabia on a wholly defensive mission, Operation Desert Shield, to protect Saudi Arabia. And British forces soon joined in, as did Arab units from Egypt, Morocco, Syria, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. A flurry of negotiations failed as Iraq refused to yield, leading Congress on January 12, 1991 to authorize the use of United States Armed Forces. And George Herbert Walker Bush did this very well, doing everything by law. And 4 days later, more than 30 nations, including 10 Islamic countries, imagine that, launched Operation Desert Storm against Iraq, and the swift-moving Allied ground assault began on February 24th and lasted only 4 days. Iraqi soldiers surrendered by the thousands, and this was an American-led multinational force that defeated Hussein in the first Gulf War, and it ended the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait. And this is a nice picture of Saddam in his propaganda poster. He's always got his military uniform on, like Fidel Castro. And this is from February of 91. On February 28th, 6 weeks after the fighting began, President Bush called for a ceasefire, and the Iraqis accepted, and the shooting ended. There were 137 American fatalities. The lowest estimate of Iraqi deaths, civilian and military, was 100,000. The coalition forces occupied about a fifth of Iraq, but Hussein's tyrannical regime was intact. What came to be called the First Gulf War was thus a triumph without victory. Hussein had been defeated, but he was allowed to escape and foster greater mischief. The consequences of the brief but intense First Gulf War, the mother of all battles, in Saddam Hussein's words, would be played out in the future in ways no one had predicted. Arabs who felt humiliated by the lopsided American triumph began plotting revenge that would spiral into a new war of terrorism. And now Bush's New World Order For months after the first Gulf War in 1991, George Herbert Walker Bush seemed unbeatable. His public approval rating soared to 91%, yet the aftermath of Desert Storm was mixed because Saddam Hussein's iron grip on Iraq was still intact, and the Soviet Union, meanwhile, stumbled on to its surprising end. And on December 25th, 1991, the Soviet flag over the Kremlin was replaced by the flag of the Russian Federation. The Cold War had ended, with the dismemberment, as we mentioned in the previous video, of the Soviet Union and its 15 republics, and as a result, the United States had become the world's only dominant military power. And containment of the Soviet Union, the bedrock of the United States foreign policy for more than 4 decades, had suddenly become irrelevant. For all its potential horrors, the Cold War had brought stability because the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, had restrained themselves from an all-out war that may well have involved the use of nuclear weapons, because both sides had the triad. They both had air, sea, and land missiles capable of destroying each other. It was a mad world, ladies and gentlemen. Mutual assured destruction prevented the use of any of these weapons, fortunately. Now the world would witness a growing number of unresolved political crises and unstable regimes, some of which had access to weapons of mass destruction, nuclear as well as chemical and biological weapons. Bush struggled to interpret the fluid new international scene. He spoke of a new world order, but he never defined it. And he admitted that he had trouble with the vision thing. And by the end of 1991, the euphoria of the Gulf War victory had worn off, and a listless Bush faced a challenge in the Republican primary from the feisty conservative commentator and former White House aide Patrick Buchanan, who adopted the slogan America First and called on Bush to bring home the boys. The excitement over the Allied victory in the Gulf War quickly gave way to anxiety over the depressed economy. Domestic issues will undermine George Herbert Walker Bush. In addressing the recession, Bush tried a clumsy balancing act. On the one hand, acknowledging that people are hurting, while on the other telling Americans that this is a good time to buy a car. And by 1991, public approval rating of his economic policy had plummeted to 18%. So in the election of 1992, in contrast to the divided Republicans, the Democrats presented a new image of being centrist or moderate, and they were very, very firm in this. And for several years, the Democratic Leadership Council, led by Arkansas Governor William Jefferson Clinton, had been pushing the party from the liberal left to the center of the political spectrum. Clinton called for a third way positioned between conservatism and liberalism. The 1992 campaign also featured a third-party candidate, the Texan H. Ross Perot, a puckish billionaire who had sold his electronics company to General Motors. And he found a large audience for his criticism of Reaganomics as voodoo economics, as I mentioned in a previous video. This was a phrase originally used by George Herbert Walker Bush in the primaries in 1980, before he was named the vice presidential candidate on the Reagan presidential ticket. Ross Perot is calling attention to the impending crisis being posed by the huge federal debt. And that's usually what third parties do, call attention to things that the major parties are ignoring. And the New Democrats will be led by President Clinton. And they challenge the liberal direction of the party. He's a self-described moderate seeking the Democratic presidential nomination, and Clinton promised to cut the defense budget, provide tax relief for the middle class, and create a massive economic aid package for the former republics of the Soviet Union to help them forge democratic society. So this is his middle way, right? Tax relief, but at the same time, aid to people in need. And after a series of bruising party primaries, Clinton won the Democratic presidential nomination in the summer of 1992, promising to restore the hopes of the forgotten middle class. and he chose as his running mate Albert Gore Jr. of Tennessee, and he's a raging moderate. So the Democratic candidates were two Southern Baptists from adjoining states, Arkansas and Tennessee. And the Clinton-Gore team hammered Bush on economic issues to win over working class voters. It's the economy, stupid. And Clinton pledged that, if elected, he would cut the federal budget deficit in half in 4 years while cutting taxes on middle-class Americans. Such promises helped Clinton win the election with 370 electoral votes and about 43% of the popular vote. Bush received 168 electoral votes and 39% of the popular vote, and Perot garnered 19% of the popular vote, more than any third-party candidate since Theodore Roosevelt. And if he had campaigned harder, ladies and gentlemen, he might have won this election. And so, the two baby boomers, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, here at the end of the campaign, will now lead the United States in the last decade of the 20th century. And that concludes chapter 29.